Hello, everyone. Thank you for showing up so early on a Saturday morning. I hope you have a coffee, because it's going to be a bit intense, so you're going to need a bit of energy to follow all of this. So we're going to focus a lot on governance today, and the idea is how is algorithms, smart contracts in general, are helping supercharge what we're doing with governance. So I'm going to walk you through a bit of history, how governance used to be, how it still is, and kind of where it's going. Because honestly, it's scary, and it's good to have at least a bit of light at the end of the tunnel to know where we're going. So just before that, it's always good to have a bit of context, because everything that someone says is biased, right? I work in governance. I used to be a banking lawyer before, so it's important for you to understand that I'm also a business grad, and I work in DeFi, so it's going to be highly focused around corporate governance, because this is what I know. If I start talking a lot about democracies or even about community governance, I'm probably not going to say things that some of you are going to like if you're passionate about governance. To give you a bit of idea of Pardin, the project I co-founded, we built 3 dApps on Ethereum that are basically around vote markets and governance infrastructure. We have roughly 800 community members. We raised a few funds. We're actually a profitable project right now, which is always good in the current market, right? And we're managing over $10 million of voting rights. That figure is actually untrue. It's over 25 right now, but we're going fast, so yeah. Okay, moving on to governance. What is governance? I like to have a very simple definition of what governance is, which is the process of decision-making. So why so simple? Because you can basically govern around everything, right? It's just about people getting together and deciding what the direction is going to be for a specific project. That's it. So there's many types of governance, but if you want to simplify it, you can think of it in 3 ways: hierarchical, collegial, and democratic. What does it mean? One person is deciding, or a very, very small group. One group of people is deciding, and everyone is deciding together. So we can see that depending on the different structures, for example, companies tend to be hierarchical, states tend to be democratic at the bottom and collegial at the top. And this is super important to understand because it changes the dynamic of how the decision-making process happens. We're going to see why it's actually very interesting, because if you look at corporate governance is actually quite new, because companies are only at 300 or 400 years in terms of entity. They're quite young. So just to give you an idea, we saw them actually almost 500 years. Yay. But they appeared in the 17th century when states realized they needed a lot of money to actually do the explorations. So they started building entities that would basically be able to attract speculation and enable them to finance all of these expeditions. It changed a lot with the United States, especially during the conquest of the West, because the state wasn't really present at the time, so corporations were ruling a lot some places during the conquest of the West. And it changed again during globalization, because companies went from very local to global. And that's actually very important in terms of to understand how big the current companies are and the way they're structured. So most companies are structured the same way they were 200, 300 years ago, but they actually change scale and they're as big as states now. So that's why you see some CEOs that are extremely powerful, because they don't have the right organization compared to the actual size. So I just wanted to give you an idea of how it works in corporate governance, and now onto democracies. On the side of political governance, I think it's important to see how it works, specifically what's working and what's not working, because we are in times where there's a lot of unsatisfaction towards what's happening in political democracies. So what's the problem? And this is actually a picture that was taken last week in Paris. It's not that low. The problem that we see right now is that there's a lowering problem of participation. It's also true in corporate governance, and it's extremely true in crypto. There's also something that's simple, is that you're prone to sabotage, in the sense that people can very easily come in and try to break the system from internally, because it's a human system. It's just social engineering, right? And the second thing is that it's inconsistent. If you look at politics, elections happen every 4, 5, 6 years, 7 years, depending on the countries, and usually they change sides. Democrats, Republicans, Democrats, Republicans. So what happens? You don't have a correct line of direction over the course of decades, simply because politics keeps changing of sides. So what we're actually seeing is that there's a huge loss of trust in the model, slowly but surely. So we went from, for example, monarchies to republics, and now we're saying, hey, what's next? Because nothing is eternal. So what's coming next? And the truth is that it's a bit scary what's coming next, because what's coming next is actually algorithmic governance. So it's built on something That's called blockchains. I'm not going to teach you, everyone here what a blockchain is, but what's very, very interesting about a blockchain is simply the characteristic that you're switching part of the decision-making process by an algorithm. So you're saying, hey, out of all the decisions we need to take, part of it is going to be taken by a smart contract, and we won't have a choice because the program is going to enforce it. So what does this mean? It means that we can scale trustlessly. That's it. That's the huge value of blockchains. And that's why at the point, even when we had proof of work and it was consuming a lot of energy, people were ready to pay a lot. And people are still paying like $5, $10, $20, $30 just for a transaction in Ethereum. Why do they do this? Because it's a trustless system, and removing trust on certain decisions has a lot of value. If you think about finance, the number of banks that have fallen over the past month, and we're in Switzerland, right? I think no one here is educated, knows better than you guys about the topic. It's better if you know that the project is actually not going to default and go away with your money, right? So blockchain is about trust, paradoxically. It's the fact that you know exactly what's going to happen, because instead of trusting a human, which is unpredictable, you're trusting a contract, you're trusting an algorithm. So what's algorithmic governance? By now it should be, there's a slide that was skipped, it's okay. Algorithmic governance is doing the decision-making process, but replacing it with smart contracts or with algorithms in general. What does this mean? It means that in general, for example, you're going to rely on algorithms on your decision-making process. So for example, you're going to use oracles, and instead of having people saying, hey, I think we should do this because this is happening, we're just going to list, if X happens, we go in this direction. If Y happens, we're going to exit the funds from the project. If Z happens, we're going to give it back to users. And you don't have context, you don't have humans, it's just looking at values and executing. So it can be good, it can be bad. For example, if you look at the way we can do with lending, it means that the house will never fall, because theoretically it's always liquidating lenders before they're actually underwater. This is an example. Okay. For example, with liquidity. So again, Swiss project. I've tried to be thematic with the project, but it's interesting because we're on a governance talk, and we're actually talking about the most ungoverned project. Is it because it doesn't have governance? Well, liquidity actually has governance in the sense that there are decisions that are taken by the project, but they're just taken by the smart contract, not by the people. And this is what's interesting. It means that it's a project that is entirely run by its lines of codes. So all of the decision making, what happens when are users liquidated, or how do you pay them back, all of this is done by the smart contracts and by incentives. And this is what is really interesting, is that even when there's no governance, at some point, if there's no arbitrageurs, the system doesn't work. So in a sense, it's extremely hard to have a system that's going to interact with humans if there's no actual humans that are powering the system at some point. So instead of thinking about automating everything, we're ChatGPT era, right? Humans are going to be useless, ChatGPT is going to do everything. That's not how it works. Each time we have a new invention, what happens is that it's just a tool that people are going to use. So you're going to have a human that's going to be above, and that's going to operate it one way or another. And that's what you have with liquidity. You have users that are opening troves, and then arbitrageurs that are helping the peg be restored. Nothing can be entirely programmatic. And this is why, for example, I'm a big fan of Curve. Disclosure, we build a lot on top of Curve. Again, also a Swiss project, apparently. And the idea of what's happening with Curve, and that's very interesting, is that they have a programmatic system of emissions and of tokenomics. But what they do is they entirely rely on incentives for people to participate. And this is what is really interesting with algorithmic governance. It's just not about replacing some part of the of the decision-making process with smart contracts. It's also about building the right incentives for people to come in and interact with the contracts at a specific time. So what this graph is, it's the design of the size of the gauge in Curve. So what Curve does is that they control the emissions, their emissions, the way they distribute their token, through a distribution that's done on a vote every week. And this graph, the resolution isn't that great, I'm sorry guys, but it's just the different actors and how much of the share of the gauge they're having. And what's really interesting is that you can actually see the different wars, in a sense, happening, where people are trying to take control and then disappearing. For example, which one? The purple one that you think that's really big and that stops at one time, it's Terra. And there's a few others. When you read at this chart, you can actually see the theory and the history of governance. And what's interesting is that at some point, the project stops paying incentives or disappears, people stop voting for it. And that's what's really interesting is that we are going to have to learn to read coordinations of machines and how humans interact with them. And that's the whole point of tokenomics. So that's something that's extremely important to understand is that the way we're seeing algorithmic governance go, it's going to have positive and negative impacts on the way we interact together. And we're talking about DeFi today, but you have to understand that the future of states, the future of companies, the future of associations, they're all going to have algorithms at some point that are embedded into it. So what's the advantage of using such type of governance? First one is that there's no corruption possible. You can't go to a machine and offer him coffee or like offer him a restaurant. It does not work. They do just a mission and they execute it. The second thing is that theoretically, and if there are devs here, they're going to laugh, it's consistent. So when it works, it is consistent. And that's the important part, is that you can rely on it much more than a human being that sometimes is not going to wake up, sometimes he's going to be tired, sometimes he's not going to be in the right state of mind to actually do what he's supposed to do. So he's not going to execute as consistently. And the last thing, which is true for every technology, is that it's more granular in the sense that you can be much more specific about what you want it to do. So for example, you can have a smart contract that's going to do one very specific task, and that's it. And it's more scalable. So in a sense, a bigger problem that we've had in governance systems up until now is that we've had trouble in basically scaling them. It's very hard for us to have very large-scale system for governance, simply because it's hard to coordinate a lot of people at the same time. Algorithmic governance is the solution to this. However, and that's the big problem with this system, is that it can't adapt to context. So I used to be a lawyer. The beautiful thing about law is that it adapts to concept. You have rules, but the rule bends depending on the context. You're like, hey, yeah, but maybe this person wasn't wrong in this specific context. It's just we weren't aware that this could happen this way. And law can bend depending on this. Smart contracts, they don't. Like if there's an oracle that doesn't take the right value and suddenly everyone gets liquidated, you're done. You lost all your money. This does not happen in the traditional world right now. So this is the problem with algorithmic governance, is that it can actually be played in a way. This is also because of the fact that there's no human interaction. So we're basically building a machine system, and the best way a machine system can work is with another machine. So we have to understand that it's very good to build systems that are going to scale just between machines talking to each other. But if you have a human at the end, they're always going to have some pain points, and it's always going to be a problem. So you need to find the right balance between doing the algorithm and having human decision making. It's probably going to be half and half. And the last thing, I wrote predictable. So you might think, hey, consistent, predictable, that's kind of the same thing. Why is it in both sides? Well, if you know how a system is going to behave each time you interact with it, you can actually game it. So there's no corruption, but there's gamification that's possible. And that's actually another point, is that it's dangerous. So that's why you have all these debates, for example, when people are hacking projects, they're like, hey, I didn't steal the money. I used the code and did what was intended. That's a debatable explanation. And some people went to jail for this. So what can we expect from algorithmic governance and the way it's going to reinvent? I'm not going to tell you it's going to change everything. It is. But it's not going to change everything over our lifetimes. So we shouldn't worry about that. We should just worry about the ways it's going to change over the course of what we're doing right now. Why? Because all of this is basically going to change the way humans interact with each other over the next centuries. So your kids, I mean, for some of you that have tried ChatGPT, you're like, wow, what I've done over the past 20 years is useless. No, it's not true. But a lot of it is going to get basically change the way people interact with each other, the way people work. It's just going to change. So what happens here? First, we're going to automate a lot of intermediaries. That was the promise of crypto, right? But it's becoming clearer and clearer this is happening. So we're going to remove some banks, we're going to remove some hedge funds, and instead, it's just going to be smart contracts doing this. Two, we're going to reduce a lot of the quantity of number of people and the time dedicated to governance. Everything that's burdensome is going to be managed by algorithms, and everything that's important, everything that needs context is going to be managed by humans. So for example, you're probably always going to have a human judge. But instead, you're probably going to have someone that's going to be able to find all of the relative items and analyze everything that's actually happened, find the data automatically. So you're going to have automated oracles in the sense but it's going to be limited on the real decision-making side that has impacts on humans. So we're basically lowering the quantity of decisions that need to be taken, but raising the the quality of the ones that need to be taken. And the last one, which is very important, we're lowering the human complexity. So you won't have 15 persons you have to talk to, huge rule books. It's going to be much easier, but it's going to be much more technical. It's probably going to be IT. So if you don't know how to code, please learn how to code, because this is going to be a very important one. Yeah, that was the slide that was supposed to be at the beginning. By the way, some of these slides were done with Midjourney. Some of these slides were done by my designer. Some of these slides were done by myself. If you want the version at the end, you can have a look and try to find which one were which. So this is the important part. We've talked a lot about choosing between humans, between machines, algorithms. One important part is that we've been talking a lot about AGI lately. I think it's possible to have simply protocols that will be governed by this kind of AGIs. They will exist. You're going to have people who are going to try to bring them forward. And it's important to understand that these are going to be like subsets and parts of our society that are going to start appearing very quickly. So self-governed entities. And my take is that they're going to be pretty dangerous, especially at the beginning, simply because they will not have the capacity to enter enough context to be able to do the right decisions. So what's very interesting is that you will see no governance system that actually lasts over 500 years. Every civilization collapses, right? Because they evolve, and at some point they reach something that doesn't work. And it's going to be exactly the same thing with AGI. Simply because nothing is omniscient, nothing goes always in the right direction, so at some point they collapse. And why we should be careful, it's simply about putting them in the right place. It's a machine in the end. It only has the power that you give them. So, conclusion, I think that's really important. We're all going to have to live with the fact that part of governance is slowly going to be replaced by algorithms. And I think it's really important that all of you appreciate what's happening and how you should prepare to it. So first of all, we're going to need to redefine a lot of the governance systems we have been doing up until now. And we're simply going to have to think about the scope of what we have been building, in what direction are we going, and how do we basically work less on this and focus on what actually matters, which are the important decisions. The second, I've mentioned it, learn to code. Learn to read the code, and if you don't, read the docs. It's when you go into a crypto project, a normal project always has documentation. Please go and read it so you know what's actually supposed to happen. Because if you don't, you will be surprised by the interactions. And the third thing is important, take the red pill. Simply accept that we're moving away from entire human-to-human interaction. It doesn't mean that we have to entirely stop. It just means that we already started. In a sense, most of human interactions are actually happening through machines today. Most of the compliments you're giving are actually from Instagram, when you're liking a photo. Much of the information you're gathering is not through conversation, but through reading articles, through watching videos. So we've already taken a step into this. The question is, how much of a step do we want to take into this? And personally, that's one of the reasons why I like crypto so much. It's that it's not about submitting to what's happening. It's about choosing the system you want to get into. And so if you don't want to get into the system that most of the people are getting into today, you can just create your own, fork it. That's it. Thank you very much. And if you have questions... Yeah, we have finance.
So we actually have time for some questions if anybody has something they want to talk to Romain about.
Hi. I was interested in knowing... So, not really, ça n'a pas vraiment à voir avec le talk, but in the governance process, how important do you think it is for protocols to separate what gets to be chosen, what gets to be voted on by governance versus what the core team and what they get to choose on, well, what they get to actually vote on themselves, and not present to bring up to a vote for the governance process?
So that's a very up-to-date topic, especially for us. But I think it depends on the maturity of the project. Early on, it's extremely hard to be simply very decentralized because you haven't distributed enough to be able to do this. The idea is to let go as you go. So I think a big problem in the projects we have seen, especially right now, is that they've scaled to a size where they're expected to have the resilience, the distribution, and the organization of a large-scale company, or even sometimes a small state. But in the end, it's just 3 people in a basement. So it kind of creates a dichotomy between both. I would say today, you need a technical team that's going to drive the project. And then everything else around resource management, etc., can actually be governed by the company. But again, it's like a slider. In a sense, the more you're pushing towards decentralization, the less the core team actually has to be there. And this is actually why you have to expect the large stakeholders to actually get away simply from these projects. Right now, we're talking about token voting because it's the biggest system in crypto. But we're probably going to have new systems. But as long as you have token voting, when you have a project that fundraised, a core team that took a large allocation at the beginning, if you want the project to really become decentralized, you're going to have to expect them to slowly sell and get away from the project. In a sense, a project builds for 5 years, and at some point, the core team has like faded away. They're still building or still doing something around the project. They're just not central anymore.
With Maker, for example, the fact that they've decentralized the project so much has brought up some problems in the governance process. How important do you think, even on the long term, I mean, even if a protocol looks to decentralize the entire governance, how important do you think it is still for the team to have some, like the initial core team with the initial vision of the project, to still have some input, some like kind of executive input on the direction of the project for certain aspects?
It again depends on the way the project has scaled and how functional it is. Because if you look at Maker, today it's just one of the co-founders that's basically coming back and re-centralizing the project to redefine the vision and basically allow it to go to another scale, taking it up a notch, right? But if you're a brick project that is basically just accomplishing its mission of public goods, you don't really need to come back and re-centralize, right? You can just have the project organically grow. And that's the complexity, but the beauty of these projects is that we expect them to go in one direction, but if you want it to go in the one direction, you need a core team, or at least a decision-making body that's going to push it in this direction and be consistent with it. On the opposite side, if you want to be fully decentralized, you have to expect chaos. You have to expect something where it's going to go in all of the directions, and 99% of the time it's going to fail, and in one direction it might succeed. So it basically depends which type of projects you want to build and how ambitious you want. Not everyone wants to build $1 billion project. Some people just have one key mission and they just want to execute it well.
Okay, so I think we have time for one more question if anybody has one. Otherwise, I would have one, if you don't mind. Yeah. So I was just curious, you talked about how governance systems change over time and no governance system is eternal. So if we're in a period of transition right now, do you foresee in the future a scenario where we have, for large societal infrastructures and systems, purely algorithmic governance, or are we always going to be hybrid?
No, I think it's going to happen, and I hope it's going to happen. If you look at, for example, this is very up-to-date in France, everything that's about retirement, right? This could actually be automated in the sense that you would actually be able to be an opt-in or opt-out system. You come in, you pay every month, you get points, and at some point where you stop, you just get an allocation that's just paying you back for the points you got. I'm just giving us an example. But in a sense, we already have some things that are pretty algorithmic because we're just following some specific type of rules. It's just that we haven't really expressed them through code entirely. And that's what we're going to see. It's probably going to be opt-in, opt-out system where people just come in. It's basically network states.
One more, real quick. All right, the last one, keep it quick.
How many people are actually going to be able to read the code?
That's a good question. So I would say a growing number of people, because a lot of crypto natives are doing it today. Also remember that a lot of the younger ones actually learn coding at school. And the third thing is that today you can just use, like for example, something like ChatGPT and say, explain to me the code. So basically anyone can read the documentation, right? But if you can have software that actually creates the documentation,
So to be a lawyer, you went to school for years to become a lawyer, to understand how law works. And a very large proportion of the population didn't, and a substantial proportion of the population probably couldn't. And I think that's going to be the same problem with what do we do? The point about using systems that can explain the code, that's actually a really good one. That's a valuable thing to be able to have that we haven't had so much in the past. But it is an interesting question of, do people have time to understand what you're asking them to do?
So that's the dramatic, and maybe I'm going to end with this and we can finish outside just for you guys not to be too late, but that's the dramatic fact about crypto and tech in general, is that we're erring towards complexity and inequality. Before it used to be where you were born geographically, in which family you were born, and the more we're going into the future, the more it's going to be around, hey, are you able to read code, understand what's actually happening? And you're seeing it today. I mean, there's a lot of 20-something people that have more money than 50-something people just because they play their cards correctly in DeFi. Or just they got lucky, right? So we're seeing something where inequality is moving to tech literacy. And this is extremely scary because if you're born in a place where you don't have internet or not, you don't have good access, you didn't learn to code, you're done. Right? It's crazy.
Thanks a lot. That was excellent.
Thank you.